Okay, so we've had everything that we've had up till now, and then I want to use this last class time to sort of offer something of a critique. In my head, this session has been called Failures and Futures, where we can just think about some of the stuff we've read and some of the tensions we discovered there, and just be critical in the very best sense of the word about that. And I'll speak a little bit more about my own experience. And then we'll talk about, particularly on the theological side, some sort of extensions, maybe we would say, of liberal theology, which will be the very briefest, just like here's some more stuff to read someday. But we'll see how the time is developing there. And then we'll just kind of sum it all up by looking again at those sets of tensions that have been revealed, in this strange dialogue or dialectic even between conservative or fundamentalist forces in religion and liberalizing or evolutionary forces, however we want to get there. Anyone bringing any questions from previous classes, or even like, gosh, I'm gonna have to learn more about that, or anything? Just want to make sure that your needs are being met. Yeah, Bill.
I was so surprised to learn in 2 classes ago that there was a very strong, it wasn't Trinitarian, but a strong Christology, is that the right word? In the I was going to say in your church, in
You
your
can.
whatever. I didn't know that I was under the impression that Unitarian Universalists would never have even said the word Christ or Jesus. And evidently it certainly wasn't true in the mid 19th century. And I am now told that it isn't necessarily true today. It depends on the congregation where they're coming from.
That's
Is that correct? I got that right?
Yeah,
that
it
was
is
a
correct.
surprise.
Yeah. The farther back east you would go, the more you might find congregations that are still comfortable being more Christocentric. Often these old Massachusetts churches that were literally the first churches in the land that were founded and then became Unitarian in the early 1800s. So they often carry some of that. But broadly speaking, compared to any other plainly Christian church, even the Congregationalists or whatever, on the liberal side of thereof, it would still seem way less Christ-oriented to you, I suspect, because it has to continually, make room very broadly. But some do it gracefully. At First Parish in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I went to church for a while I went to divinity school, we still actually read Micah, walk humbly and love chesed and love mercy and so on. And so, and it was still posted up there in the old time carving on the wood or whatnot. Yeah.
I found that real interesting.
Chris, I don't want to bring up any sore points here, but was there a time when the Church of England was persecuting Unitarians? Was that a thing?
That was a thing, Matt.
You want to talk about it?
It's too soon. Let's just, let's just be cool. No, you are correct. And later, when I talk a little bit more about the tradition and stuff like that, I mean, some of that fact of that being the case at the birth, at least, of the ideas that gave rise to it, that still carries forward in the karma of the tradition. Bruce.
I found the articles you gave us to read really thought-provoking, and I think some of them were coming from a conservative point of view. And maybe somewhere this concept of, social gospel and social salvation.
Mm.
I thought that jumped out at me. It also jumped out at me that term, what would Jesus do? Apparently, really originates way back in 1890 or something.
That
And then
blew
the
my mind.
final thing is that the idea of liberation theology, sort of termed radical Marxism, seeking to create social justice. And we haven't even mentioned the word liberation theology. I wonder, is it dead? But those are just some things that I thought the readings kind of brought out, at least in terms of terminology.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Anyone else have something in mind at this point before we move forward?
Chris,
Okay.
when I've been reading through all of the papers and thinking back of various times in Trinity itself, I love in the progressive church their care for justice, the underdog,
Mhm.
eliminating cruelty, professing kindness. But in the congregations, I see no people obviously of working class. And the few times in earlier years when one or two came into the Wednesday evening meals and started talking at the round table and so on, they were kind of quickly ignored.
Mhm.
I find progressive tends to become highly attached to intellectuality,
Mm.
um, less to the body in
Mhm.
many ways, including all of the amazing things that body work does in our society. I think we wouldn't eat or sleep on a comfortable bed or anything else. So I wonder, am I really biased or have I mistaken something?
No, I think you've fairly ably described something. I mean, I can't speak to it at Trinity, just really at all, as far as what the dynamics are there. But boy, congregations are there are many forces that bring them together as a community, and social and cultural similarities is just such an easy and obvious one. We rely on it all the time in our lives in other ways, and it's natural to be rooted there.
Yeah.
And it takes a certain kind of intention, and the carpet gets really dirty, and there's other things that you can't have if you go in that other path. So, and there's I mean, the best point of view, I guess, is that there's church for everybody.
But I think it gets very narrow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we actually, even our intellectuality gets squeezed a bit
Mm-hmm.
because of that narrowness.
Meaning it's certain to be more narrow or not as richly fed because it's too inwardly focused.
Well, there's facts of life,
Yeah.
and there's
Yeah.
facts of behavior,
Right.
and there's results of perception that we don't get by connecting with an otherness.
Yeah, here. Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, that's a good question then. Are there ways to, do that gracefully, whether individually or collectively? To me, it feels, but I'm a universalist. God loves truly everybody exactly equally already right now and is rooting for you with all his, her, it, or their hearts. And so, to me, it's like always worth asking, are the doors really open? And how are we, cultivating our ability even to like love each other by encountering people who are quite different from ourselves? even a little bit different. I mean, when was the last time the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians had a volleyball game or something like that, just to even get together? Yeah.
You know, one of the articles hitting this point a little bit, they were saying that the social gospel appeals to a lot of young people, but the problem is that there's just not a good way of building that. The social gospel folks are really good spiritual entrepreneurs, but not good at institution building. And so they felt that it won't move on, which is kind of another comment on how broad the base is, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And with, you know, the internet and other soon to come virtual realities and so on, I mean, who knows what shape communities and institutions might take in the future, where we're mostly, you know, connected with our brains and these kinds of screens and experiences and so forth. I mean, that to me, no one knows that. No one could even guess, I think, at this point. So yeah, we'll see what. Well, I hope we get to see what happens, but maybe that'll be for others to determine. Wonderful. I so appreciate, you know, just all the thoughtful conversation that we've had here together. It's been really good for me to kind of work these muscles of mine a little bit. I was thinking to kind of get us rolling in a different direction a little bit now, and offer at least sort of my critique as a conversation starter. The class was called Foundations of Religious Liberalism. And that phrase has been sticking in my head because frequently as well in the old text and anything they ever made me read or whatever, we would also use the phrase liberal religion. And as though they were one and the same. Religious liberalism or liberal religion. And I guess as Unitarian Universalists maybe use them, they are treating them the same. But I felt a difference in the terms. And this is the kind of the lead into the critique. In the phrase religious liberalism, the liberalism is I can't remember my grammar. It's the word that religious is modifying, right? Liberalism is the thing. What kind of liberalism? Religious liberalism. Is there a former teacher here who knows what word that is?
We're talking about nouns and adjectives.
Okay, it's just a noun. I guess there was some other word I had in mind. I know it's a noun, but thank you.
Good. Going back to 7th grade language arts teaching days.
Yeah, like the antecedent or something. It doesn't matter. In any event, religious liberalism means liberalism that's somehow religious, whereas liberal religion, in my ears, means religion that is liberal, in the sense that we've been talking about this whole time of, you know, tolerant and open to the freedom of conscience and so on. And what my experience of this whole tradition, you know, with its hundreds of years of history and its contemporary expression, at least within my, I'll say, former tradition, Unitarian Universalism, is that it is religious liberalism. It is liberalism pursued with the focus and fervor of a religion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that some of the essential qualities of religion, as I understand it, are necessarily going to be present. So, I guess I'm not a religious liberal. I'm a liberal religious person. And I, you know, had concerns and a critique about that tradition from the very time of beginning to think about being a minister. I was a religious studies major in college, came to it around that time. It all just seemed to open very plainly. I loved the principles and the core ideas of the thing. And as a person who'd had a good experience with my Christian church growing up and was grounded in Buddhism as well, there's a dimension of ultimacy that seemed to be missing meaning God or the spiritual core. And I hoped and believe maybe it could still be the case that just a broad principle of love might serve that role. But that's difficult, and it doesn't, in the way that it's practiced there at least. I still think it might happen someday. That'll be the world religion of the future. But it was difficult to make that cohere in that context. And so, and I felt that from the beginning, and I wondered, would that work? And I too respected the kind of worldly focus of things, but that tension was there forever, and it has clearly resolved in a I need something different kind of direction. So at least some my experience of anything I would say about liberal or religious liberalism broadly, you just have to know, is shaped by that experience. And so the biggest issues are the pitfalls, is that it comes to be so conflated with politics or with social justice, so-called social reform, whatever, that then that can become its own form within the tradition of fundamentalism. Because it's not liberal religion, it's religious liberalism, or now religious progressivism. And even though, the vast majority of people, as is true at any congregation, aren't really doing a whole lot of that. They're just coming to church on Sunday to get a good word about hope and love and the possibility of the human species surviving and so on. So, and if you spent any time on some of those more progressive, cat's not allowed there, sites, you'll see the emphasis is so much on social justice. And again, I'm not saying all that work doesn't need to be done immediately, but that's not ultimately the reason people go to church. That's the rice cooker which is beeping, and I trust it will stop. It has. And at least in that context, Unitarian and Universalism, and then Unitarian Universalism, the experience of having been heretics, so-called, and even so burned, with an identity as to the early martyrs and so on, even though their theology and their beliefs and practices are totally different, as was observed earlier in the session. The first Universalists, the folks who thought Jesus had died for everybody, so no one was going to end up in hell forever, they were straight up Trinitarian Christians in every other way. But even that, once upon a time, could get you burned at the stake and get your books all burned and everything. And somehow that, almost all of these, achievements of more freedom and respect for people to have different views and so forth without violence, they were all very hard won. And so, but that certain branch of religious liberalism is kind of rooted in it somehow. And even when I was still becoming a minister, one of the expressions you would hear a lot was like, heretics and proud of it, right? And to my experience, it was just standing too much in opposition to more conservative or fundamentalist ideas or whatever, but almost reifying them by proclaiming, well, first and foremost, we're definitely not that. We think differently than that over there. We're, tolerant. And that makes it hard to just say what you're about in a positive and constructive way that's healing and makes life better rather than more challenging. And then overall, of course, you must have noticed, we read all these guys from the 1800s and so forth. Just about all of it up until the last 30 or 40 years has been, Eurocentric, reformist, not revolutionary, reformist at best. Religious liberalism broadly, particularly those eras that we talked about as foundations. A fellow named Grant Wacker at Duke said, First and foremost, it functioned as a way of legitimizing or even sacralizing the ideals of Victorian culture, including frugality, sobriety, punctuality, hard work, delayed gratification, male supremacy in the public sphere, female supremacy in the domestic sphere. That was totally true until the early 1900s of any of these books we would have read. Honor in personal relations, and the superiority of American culture generally. Yeah. And Emerson's, of course, a great champion of that. So in a modern age where perspectives that are much more informed and much more diverse in their origins and experiences and so forth are now recognized as wise and necessary. Where do these voices fit in, I guess, is a question, an open question. So that was, from my little corner of the world. And then there's, of course, all of the beautiful, beautiful stuff that drew me to it in the first place, of the elevation of the human spirit and human possibility, and that the goodness in us is in a direct relationship to the goodness in the divine. The possibility of things getting better, evolving, moving forward, changing, and all of that being positive. So there's much that I love about it, and we'll say more positive after I give you a chance to say any other things that, caught you as we went along, where you're like, well, I love that part, but I don't love that part. Okay, well, that's all right. I guess I've perfectly played everything.
I'll chime in.
All right.
Talking about the sort of the fundamentalism, if you will, of religious liberalism, taking liberal ideals and elevating them to a religion, as opposed to taking a religion and making it more liberal. I love that distinction. When it comes to religious liberalism, by contrast, you're always going to find groups of people for whom everything is black and white. And it's just a simple judgment. And of course, we believe this and that and that. And we are not the kind of people who believe that and that and that. And the community defines itself very easily and clearly as if it's common sense that if you're a thinking person, this is where you're going to end up on all of the issues. And I grew up in a household like that. It was just obvious to us. There's liberalism and it's right. And here's what it means to be a liberal. Lately, I've been aware more and more of how nothing is simple and everything is complicated and there aren't any easy answers. And by the way, I'm complicit in all of the evils that I condemn. And the other day, Nathan and I were talking about the big conversation going on at Trinity around Facebook and whether or not we continue to use Facebook as a platform, which we do quite heavily, given how Facebook is kind of destroying the world.
Just that.
Among other things. And there are people at Trinity who see that as a real issue that we need to boycott Facebook. We have to tell everybody to get off Facebook. But as Nathan and I were talking about it, and the staff got into it, what we want to do is have a series of classes where we look at the moral challenges of things like Facebook and social media, and also our complicity in those systems, and to address honestly, is it even possible in this day and age to just remove yourself from social media platforms without actually hurting the world that you're trying to help? So there's trade-offs, there's complexity, there's nuance, and there's honesty about how nobody's standing in a privileged position, purely morally righteous and able to point to everybody else and say, you guys are doing it wrong.
Right.
And we got it right. And that used to be the good old religious point of view, is you could just like stand on your pulpit and claim moral superiority and tell people off. And you just can't do that anymore. I don't think, and be honest. So
Mhm.
What does that make us if we're a progressive spiritual community that upholds progressive values, but nonetheless recognizes that it's complicated,
Mhm.
you know?
And who's calling out the mayor or the city council from the pulpit, or other people who may or may not be complicit in the troubles the city faces, and that doesn't there need to that voice need to be much more in the public sphere? There are some who think that's the primary purpose of the religious voice these days.
Is to effect legislation,
is to effect social and political change. Okay, one for Bruce, and then I've got a little more to steer us toward.
I like Matthew's comments, and I'm kind of going a different direction. For me, as I was going through the classes, I kept thinking, like you ended the last session talking about hope, and we kind of dropped that at a place where, sort of unfinished. What is hope, and so on? Is it one of the boxes, and so on? And it makes me think of George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, where all of these wonderful isms, communism, Leninism, anarchism, socialism, all came together to battle together Franco and that repressiveness. And they had all these great ideas of what the brotherhood is and the sisterhood is. And you know what happens? They end up stabbing each other in the back because they don't understand human nature. They don't get it. And I think it made, you come out of that thinking, well, Christianity maybe does. Maybe there is a real basic truth in Christianity that seems to have survived centuries, and there really is some nuggets of truth that instead of keep looking to the others, is there something that really is very fundamental and critical? And you just kind of wonder, well, is that the scripture? I mean, is that the scripture? And it strikes me that progressive liberalism, or how we want to define it, is looking for other things to sort of give it hope and not finding it. That's one of my concerns.
Yes. The lovely thoughts there. First, don't each of us have to ask, what is most critical in Christianity as we practice it or understand it for ourselves? Like, what is the thing if everything else were to boil away? Asking the question, what is the transient and permanent in my own tradition or my own spiritual life? That's a good existential question to ask. And yes, I will tell you that I don't know, whether it's Christian. Christianity does have that. Whether it's the only thing that has it is, of course, a whole different question. Does Christianity have a thing that gives people hope? Yeah, as do many other traditions, most of which are rooted in some sense of the ultimate being for our benefit or on our side at a bare minimum. And in a tradition that is focused sort of solely on the human realm and tries to be an inclusive community by not talking about issues of ultimacy so that nobody feels put off, right? We'll just assume that everybody's here is on the side of the good, right? Yeah, that much you can assume, whatever that means. But, you know, so's like 98% of all humanity everywhere. Even the people you think are weird and bad over there at their conservative church or whatever, they're, you know, they're decent people who are doing their best, actually. You work with some of them, right? Lost my train of thought.
Ultimacy.
So yeah, so then you talk less about those matters, and you don't really, you know, you've so turned God into a symbol at best, because it's hard to understand, you know, how a being could have agency and be powerful or whatever from a limited scientificistic perspective. I used that bad word, that made up word on purpose. You know, then you're just kind of rooted in human beings, and you're the only ones. It's us who have to make every change. It's us or nothing. It's very humanistic in that regard. And at least within Unitarian Universalism, that humanist tradition is proudly proclaimed, and it was downright anti-religion and wanted to stop talking about God at all. We were just going to talk about love or justice or something like that. And of course, the problem is, if you place all your faith, if the highest order of existence that your faith can go to is humanity, you're in trouble because we're a mess.
Yeah. It's a hot mess.
That doesn't mean we're not going to get better. I think we totally are. But, you know, it's just look around, disappointment. And, you know, truth be told, a lot of, again, I'm speaking just narrowly of Unitarian Universalism. Almost all folks come from some other tradition, you know, and they're still actually like in relationship to that. And they're hurt and they're mad. The easy God of their fundamentalist childhood turned out to not be believable. Well, yeah, you know, lots of us land there. But you know, the God of Unitarian Universalism is not powerful enough to readily heal that wound for most people.
Yeah.
Some, the ones that stick around, the ones who are gung-ho for social justice causes that get proclaimed and talked about loudly there, and, you know, that kind of thing. Michael, and pardon me a second.
Can we say God bless you to a Unitarian?
To me, you can.
I don't know how well I have this formulated, but listening to you, I can't decide if I'm a liberal or not. But what and I would guess I would be, because each morning next to my Book of Common Prayer, I pick up my ball of beads and do an Eastern meditation, and other reasons. But I think that the distinction I'm beginning to notice listening to you for 5 weeks is that the emphasis on the secular progressivism is, to me, a very extroverted focus. And to me, the ultimacy is much more of an interior path, much more of which may be just a personal disposition. People have different temperaments, but a lot of things that I would find having been very liberating for me, like the Oxford movement, must seem very reactionary to somebody who sees the revival of medieval forms or medieval mysticisms as they could be oppressive or something. I've never thought of them that way. I always thought of a liberal interpretation of something as being what liberates us. And say, as a gay person, liberating a passage that would say, you're a sinful person and this is taboo, and put it in the context of, say, like is it Boswell did, talking about what the meaning of a taboo was historically
Mm.
gives it a liberal interpretation that it liberates you, but it doesn't put you back in the world to me. It puts you in an inner, I wish I could articulate that clearly. It's just listening to you, I realize the liberalism is much more extroverted, much more social, much more immanent, and much less ulterior for me. It couldn't exist without a this world focus. But I think medieval Christianity can exist with an other world focus. And I wasn't even aware of that as being a perspective. Now I feel like a reactionary. I think that's what you wanted.
Yeah. Well,
Like
my work here
reaction.
is done then, Michael. No. Isn't it interesting though that like then you find other points of view and suddenly where you are on some spectrum or another,
It
and
is interesting.
yeah,
This is a
and
very interesting class.
oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, these are your words, our words collectively. Now I've put in the chat if you are able with your technology to see that. When we did that first, like, what is liberal? And this was our group mind definition, which is probably remains recognizable to people. And, first and foremost, that emphasis on freedom. Like, I don't know if I'm a liberal or not. It's like, well, do you think people of different views are, allowed to live, should be voters, are loved by God, or whatever? And you could ask a bunch of questions in that territory. And if you answer yes to them, then almost by definition, no matter how conservative you like your liturgy or any other thing, you're liberal, which is why we have that weird thing of all of America up to and even including, conservative folks, as long as they're not completely anti-democratic, and unfortunately there's a lot of those these days. But no matter how conservative you are, if you still believe in the process of democracy for solving the puzzles of humanity, that is liberalism. Because you don't want to slay your enemies any longer. And it is worth remembering, we were talking about martyrs before and everything, just how much, straight up warfare, decade upon decade upon decade upon decade, over what seems to us now fairly subtle theological differences. So we can all, I'm still, if this is liberalism, what I've just posted in the chat there, then I can still wear my sticker on my computer with pride that says Bleeding Heart Liberal. Great segue to now what I'm going to do with breakout rooms, but not just twos. I might just do 2 groups, but I want it to be a little smaller, maybe 3, just to make conversation a little easier. When we get even just this big, it can sometimes be a little more awkward. So we'll do 2 groups. And here are the questions. I'll put them back up in the room too. Ooh, I went way far away from my page looking something up. So please forgive me as I scroll. And the questions are, is Trinity liberal? How do you know? How would you like it to be more so or less so? And it's okay to want it to be less so. And it might be helpful to not just think of like the whole thing, but you could think of the, way it interacts with the community at large, how it does welcome people, what the theology might be, how the liturgy or the worship services are, or the activities that take place there. So think in just those terms. Just want to get you talking with each other. We've had all this talk about liberal. There it is in the chat. Is Trinity liberal? How do you know? How would you like it to be more so or less so? And Matt and I will float around a little bit. I'm going to recreate these rooms and just do 2. And it will assign automatically. I hope you end up with people you like. Be sure to share time generously. If you talk a lot, step back. If you don't talk much, be bold tonight. Off you go. Oh, sorry, forgot to click the button. All right, let me broadcast this message to all that has the questions. Okay, good, because I don't think the main chat they get, I think you have to do that as a separate broadcast. And then let's see, how do we go join? Let's look at participants, or maybe all right, that must have been the tail end of what I hope was a lively conversation over on your side, as we enjoyed over on ours. Thanks, Matt, for figuring out how to get us where we all needed to be. All right, well, now we're all together. Again, anything really strike you? What was your, we don't have to go through everybody's feedback, but broad or interesting observations, stuff that you thought, oh, I'm going to remember that and bring it up with Father Matt later. Tell him he needs to get some change happening, something like that. Anybody?
Okay, I'll go. And that is, I would love for us to use the ecumenical version of the Lord's Prayer. It's a far better translation. Pre-COVID, in August, I think we used Mussorgsky's version, sung version of it, and it was just ethereal. And I'm fine with what prayer 2 of the alternative liturgy. I don't need to have it every week, but I'd really like to have the ecumenical Lord's Prayer.
What's the distinctive of the ecumenical Lord's Prayer? I'm not sure I know.
Well, it doesn't use the word trespass. That's a pretty mild translation. Save us from the time of trial. Do not bring us to the test.
Okay. So words rather than meaning, or
No, it's the words. It gives the sense that God is leading us astray, and that's not the God I believe in.
Oh, that God might even lead you into, lead us not into temptation. Well, why would God ever do that in the first place?
Yeah.
It should be something more like, allow me not to be tempted, or to succumb to.
Save us from the time of trial.
Yeah,
save us from the time of trial.
Temptation does not mean sin. Temptation means trial.
Well, let's not go too far down a discussion of the Lord's Prayer, Bruce, if you don't mind. Just to stay on topic. I do appreciate your point, though, Harriet. And anyone else from that conversation? Is Trinity liberal? Is it not? More so, less so?
If we had an ecumenical Lord's Prayer, would we be more liberal? And would that then be, is that, Harriet, why you want us to change the Lord's Prayer so that we are more liberal?
No, it's not about being liberal. It's about being true to what the original prayer is.
Yes. All right. Well, we're still going to leave that there for the moment then.
That's fine.
Thank you. Though I'm, fascinated by that sort of stuff. We'll do a biblical exegesis class. All right. I need to find my notes here and see. All right. Well, I hope then that was somewhat at least interesting.
I bet more people have something to offer about what came up in small groups.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not being patient enough then. I know I've experienced this actually, that there's an awkwardness on Zoom. Nobody wants to be rude. And I've tried to cut you some slack and so on, but would it be helpful if I was just like, Bill, what did we talk about that struck you?
Silos. I liked our discussion on silos. I got people thinking about silos.
And flesh that out a little bit for those that weren't part of our group,
So
please.
we're talking about how they're in. We worry, and particularly the group that I involved with, the Commission on Cathedral Life, about silos, growing up in a church and keeping people from feeling comfortable even, or being unaware of the value of some of the other things that we encourage. And it happens almost in any organization. I would say it's a feature of that, and churches are not exempt. But churches have a stronger, in my opinion, it's more important that churches work not to let that happen in there, and particularly a church the size of Trinity. Not that we're the biggest church in the world. I have no idea about the silos in the 40,000 prosperity gospel worshipers who go to the former basketball stadium in Houston, for example. I have no idea what kind of silos they have, but even our group has it. And I bet you a church with only 100 people average Sunday attendance, there are a couple silos there if you went and look for it.
And if not everyone is familiar with that term, which doesn't just mean the things that keep different kinds of grains separate on a farm, it just means the tendency in large groups, or maybe small groups as well, for folks to just get settled in with just the people like them. And in the modern world, we talk about it a lot because with social media and online and algorithms and stuff, you can just get to the point where it's like, everybody in the world loves cats just as much as me. I know this because all I see are cat lovers, you know. Then you're in the cat lover silo, which I invite you to join me in.
Or the Fox News versus ABC silo.
In much more dangerous implications. So,
Yeah.
and we did mention it, as you spoke, Bill, it reminded me that of the centrality of worship as the experience then that brings a conceivably quite diverse group together. The fact that Trinity has, you know, all sorts of different little ways to be connected with smaller groups of people, or to live out your passion if you want to serve hungry folks, or you want to sing or paint. You know, you can have a contemplative thing, you can get all intellectual here on Wednesday nights, but then there's this glue experience. And just how vital that component is. Where it was noted, you know, well, actually, I guess it was you earlier today when we were talking about this, Matt, that, you know, the liturgy of your congregation is probably the most conservative thing about the whole place. And that's just an interesting observation.
Right.
It was noted that actually, like, the most innovative churches liturgically, rock and roll, Christian death metal, even, whatever anybody wants, in terms of that wild format, technology right in there, they're often the most conservative theologically. They are using all of those wonderful, fun tools to make sure you fully understand that this way of understanding Jesus Christ is the only way you're going to go to heaven, you know, in the end. And they're actually, somewhere back in divinity school, somebody said there seemed to be I don't know if they did a thorough enough study to be scientific about it, but there was a corollary, there's a relationship, a reciprocal relationship, that the more progressive a congregation tends to be, the more it needs to hang on tight to its worship service as unchanging. So that frequently, like some of those most old churches of the Unitarian persuasion back east, oh my Lord, it is like, it's kind of the same church service that they used in 1805. Maybe down to the hymns. You know, I've got a taste for that stuff, but not everybody does. So that's just another interesting tension, relationship.
Chris, what would you think explains that? How would you, explain that? I think your point about the evangelical churches, I mean, even here in Portland, the biggest thriving churches, Athey Creek or Rolling Hills or Foursquare, they are big on technology, but strong on, they have loose form to their services.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that?
Give the people what they want.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I personally, I would go to a rock and roll church. I've been dreaming of it. I sort of kind of tried to make mine that, but all of our musicians were 60 years old, so we sang the Beatles and Bob Dylan a lot. The kids are into that long hair stuff, I guess. So, because, and on a gut level, emotional level, the music I turn to either make or express my feelings or whatever, it's rock and roll music. So I'd be happy to go to rock and roll church. But I also want it to include, all of the components that I understand a worship service to have, which includes confession and prayer and hopefully some good word of hope and, whatever other ritual things we do. I mean, everything's in relationship and intention. And so I think, it's just that sometimes if the mind has gone large, I guess, by having like diverse groups and understanding that all of these folks can exist together, having some things that you do, some actions, some body relational experiences, those just help get everybody back together and be grounding again. I think of, at various points in even the history of our country in my life, 9/11, other times where everybody getting together at a baseball game and singing the national anthem felt like the best and utterly necessary thing that, people had to do. And actions that make us feel like we are one body. So maybe the folks who are more scattered about, need a little bit more of that in terms of hanging on to the old-fashioned form. I mean, truth be told, a lot of those rock and roll evangelical churches, the giant churches and stuff, they're cut from a cloth. You can buy that pattern. You can literally buy that pattern and build a church just like that.
Yeah.
As an entrepreneur, starting tomorrow if you want. And that's cool. But most of those congregations, they tend to fall apart and become something else, and a different church buys the building or whatever when the pastor moves on or gets tired of it or is found sleeping with somebody or whatever else happens.
Right.
It goes. I mean, we're all humans. No one's exempt from that. Okay. Well, gosh, we could, just keep the conversation rolling forever, and hopefully you will. And I just want to say, if this process of seeing how, particularly in the historical way we looked at it, less so for today, but it continues today, liberal religion, the trend toward liberalism within religion, whatever we want to say, where is the cutting edge theologically or in praxis or in relationship to the world within the Christian tradition and beyond? To me, those just feel like those remain fairly interesting questions. And so other things to look at in going forward might be, the presence I'm seeing more and more of really true religious naturalism, where a scientific and evolutionary view of the world have been incorporated into a non-personal nature as God kind of theology that seems to be growing in appeal to people. If you folks haven't read Process Theology, John Cobb is probably the primary Christian voice in that regard. On the Unitarian side, Charles Hartshorne. I would never recommend that anyone actually read Alfred North Whitehead, because no one can. But Hartshorne's book, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, completely blew my mind. That a lot of the seeming tensions, like between symbol and reality, mind, matter, reason, feeling, God that is unchanging or something, and then the evolution of the world, these are, to my mind, ably resolved in process theology, which has also the very best theology of evil, I think, of any of the Christian or even non-Christian theologies. Oh, I could say so much more. I'm merely tantalizing you for future readings or future classes. And if you are interested in the kind of political side of things pushed farther out in a powerful way, do look at liberation theology. I think just about every Christian person should read Gutierrez's A Theology of Liberation. This is on the ground. My people are getting killed by my military government. We are poor. Why are we so poor? What is going on here? Where is Christ in this, and how do we work together to change things? I mean, it was incredibly empowering for people on the ground, and it's a theology that's born of human on human suffering that I imagine most of us here have little or no experience with, and it raises a powerful critique against complacency of a certain type. I can't remember if Gutierrez was killed. I don't think he was. But
what was the movie? There was a great movie that came out about the liberation theology and what is it? Central.
I don't remember.
Yeah, the priest is gunned down while he's giving communion, and
yeah,
There's
that's
Romero.
That's
Yeah,
Oscar
Bishop
Romero.
Oscar Romero.
Romero. That's
Yeah.
it.
Oh, and they made a movie just called Romero, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So that's just that. I'm not going to say any more about those things because we're running out of time.
Well, Chris, can I say one thing to you?
Yes, please.
I would say, after having listened to you for the last 10 weeks because of the Richard Rohr class, I hope you're just not one of those passing comets that moves through the air of Trinity and then disappears in your own direction. You seem like one of the real attracting magnets of spiritual life there, and I think your friendship with Matthew is it's such a wonderful thing. I think I probably speak for everybody here and hope they can add to that. I really hope that you continue to feel Trinity as a perfect home for your energy and your thoughts, and that are so full of life and share so much with us. I just would encourage you in every possible way to remain.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that greatly, very much. Thank you.
Sure.
I do. I mean, obviously with Matt there, and I've come to church a few times and stuff, it does feel like certainly the place I'm most connected to at this stage of my life. And I've really appreciated the opportunity, and thank you for those kind words.
We used to have a resident theologian. Unfortunately, he died prematurely. Well, maybe we need to look at that, getting that set up again. Non-stipendiary, of course.
Oh. Yeah, I've done a lot of free church work in my life.
Yeah.
I think Nathan might want our resident theologian to be an Episcopalian. I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, there could
100%
be
sure
some
of that, but
concern.
maybe.
But like a jester or something like that is a role that I could thrive in. I could say. Well, any other, just like kind of final thoughts or questions you're left with for the future, or?
Well, you mentioned your experience when you were an undergraduate. Where did you go to your undergraduate years?
I attended Cleveland State University in beautiful Cleveland, Ohio, which is my hometown.
Interesting.
Yeah, and there was a small religious studies department there, and some great professors that were really impactful on me. Um, and yeah, so
But
much
was
to
it,
the horror
was
of
that,
everybody around me, I got a bachelor's degree in religious studies. And when my dad asked what I was going to do with that, I said, bartend compassionately, which was kind of how it worked out for a while.
was that a private school, or was it,
Oh no. Cleveland State is like, the big commuter school downtown where everybody who, like me, went somewhere else first and dropped out had to go, or if they didn't get their act together soon enough, or went back as grown-ups or whatever. A lot of returning adults. I mean, it's for that kind of school. I don't know what the corollary here would be. There's Portland State and University of Portland, right? So one of them is the one where like everybody can go,
mhm,
right?
Portland State?
Portland
Okay.
State.
Yeah, good. Well, Cleveland State is the Portland State of Cleveland. Maybe something like it. But I did go to a little portion of it that was called First College, which was an experiment that got started in maybe the early 80s, inspired by new models like at UC Santa Cruz. And our classes were 8 credits instead of 4 credits. They involved a ton of writing and reading. You could more or less design your own major. It fit within the College of Arts and Sciences. So I had a lot of freedom to take classes. And fortunately, 2 of the religious studies professors taught in First College. And that allowed them to, rather than teach the more kind of scholarly classes that were expected within the College of Arts and Sciences, where like if you take a class on Hinduism, you're going to learn the Vedas and the Upanishads and the yogas and this, that, and the other. But over in First College, Dr. Royster could teach Hinduism, and it included a experiential element. So we did yoga and meditated and stuff.
Interesting.
And so I mean, that changed everything for me. It was like, oh, I don't want to just talk about it. I want to do it.
Right.
So here we are.
Before we end, I want to just offer my own thanks to Chris for taking on this class. It's been wonderful. And so thank you, brother, and love you. We do have a mini retreat coming up this Saturday. If you're not yet signed up for it, there are a few seats still available. Our friend Fumi Tosu, who is a wonderful Japanese American Catholic worker, contemplative layperson who has done some teaching for us before, will be leading us in an introduction to Ignatian spiritual exercises. So I think that'll be a very wonderful retreat for those of us who are called to it. So that's 9:00 on Saturday morning. Next week begins the Advent term. So check your website to get more details on classes that are being offered. Dean Nathan's going to teach a class on the Holy Land. I'm sorry, I don't have my schedule, so I can't tell you what the other ones are. You'd think I would know since I put these things together. Menopause brain. Anyway, thank you all so much for this, and it's beautiful to see you. Thank you, Chris, again, and thank you all for your faithful and wonderful attendance. It's been really great.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matthew.
You're very welcome. So nice to meet all of you and spend this time with you. And I'll see you out there sometime soon, I trust.